Thank you very much, and hello and welcome to everyone who's joining. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really glad to see such a good turnout from our ever-growing community of practice. My name is Ned Meerdink, and I'm the Training and Technical Support Manager for the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative. I focus primarily on the Self-Reliance Index, which is part of the core focus of today's session. So very glad to have you all here. Just a quick note that the session is being recorded, so if there is any interest in kind of distributing this after the fact, you'll receive a number of communications from us with the access to the recordings and I think the presentations that will be shared today. So yeah, very happy to welcome you all here to this month's installment of our 12 months, 12 domains series. The series is designed to take a deeper, more intentional look at the Self-Reliance Index, or as we call it, the SRI, by focusing on one domain at a time, one domain per month for the entirety of 2026. So for those of you who may be less familiar with the tool, the Self-Reliance Index is a measurement tool containing 12 domains across 14 different questions that focuses on understanding how self-reliant households are and how that shifts gradually over time. Domains measure conditions and assets that increase the likelihood that refugee households will be able to continue meeting their basic needs into the future. If you're interested in learning more about the Self-Reliance Index, you can access resources directly on our website. I know my colleagues will put some links into the chat that speak to that. You can also always contact me as the focal point for the RSRI team on the Self-Reliance Index at my last name, Meerdink, M-E-E-R-D-I-N-K, at refugeeselfreliance.org. There are a ton of ways in which we can support your application of the SRI and your programming, and we're, of course, very eager to help you out. I've been working primarily on supporting partner application of the SRI since 2019. Yeah, we've dealt with many partners in many contexts, I think over 80 in over 40 countries since the launch of the tool. So yeah, very happy to receive inquiries from you at my email or via our web form if you have any questions about the tool or how it works, or would like to learn more about how we can support your application of the tool. Over the course of 2026, each monthly webinar spotlights one of the SRI's 12 domains. So the goal is to move beyond kind of high-level discussion of the domains to really dig into what each domain looks like in practice. So what it means for program design, for policy, and for how we understand and support refugee self-reliance across a variety of different contexts. One of the core understandings of the SRI is that responses in all sectors can and should contribute to promoting self-reliance. And our domain by domain series in 2026 hopes to highlight that in a very practical and approachable way. As many of you know who have been present for other sessions of this webinar series, you can expect these webinars to be kind of focused discussions. We kind of replete with practical insights and resources, expert perspectives on the domain that's highlighted, and real-world case studies from practitioners and members of the RSRI's broader community of practice. These conversations are meant to support learning, reflection, and action, using the SRI not just as a measurement tool, but as a framework for deeper understanding, more responsive programming, and more successful promotion of what we all really want, which is refugees and other displaced persons to become more self-reliant. Today, we're focusing on the safety domain. Today, we're focusing on one of the crucial domains, safety, and looking at how the safety domain and presence or non-presence of safety and security in locations of displacement plays across the different contexts in which we work. Within the SRI, the safety domain, via two-part question, seeks to establish what types of safety and security risks a displaced household contends with, and how, if present, these safety concerns actually practically impact that household's ability to seek opportunities across basic needs such as food, healthcare, education, freedom of movement, employment, etc. So really looking at the interplay between presence or non-presence of safety and security risks and how that has practical impacts on the household. In terms of safety, we very consistently refer to it as the bedrock of refugee self-reliance. Absent physical, psychological, legal safety, refugees cannot sustainably take steps to improve their lives and self-reliance. The essential role safety and security can play in enabling or hindering household self-reliance is evident in a variety of ways across our work. Um, for example, engaging in entrepreneurship, finding formal employment, or pursuing vocational training requires a certain presence of safety and security to enable folks to go out into the world and pursue those things which we know are long-term positive for their self-reliance. If a refugee fears eviction, violence, or deportation, their energy and focus can be consumed by immediate survival rather than economic stability and steps towards sustainable self-reliance. Positive safety conditions can also enable refugees to save money, invest in small businesses, pay down debt without the constant threat of exploitation and theft that many refugees encounter in their daily lives. Fleeing persecution also often leaves, as I think many of us know, deep psychological scars. So a secure and safe environment of displacement is often a precondition for accessing mental health support, medical care to address those issues. Likewise, unsafe conditions in places of displacement, especially for women, children, marginalized groups, can also expose refugees to trafficking, forced labor, gender-based violence. On the other side, legal and physical protection work promoting client safety can counteract these phenomena. Additionally, refugee access to move safely in the communities they live in, whether it be camp or urban, is essential for refugees to utilize their skills and their capacities, earn a living, and contribute to the local economy, as well as to forge relationships with host communities that can further be beneficial in terms of their ability to become self-reliant and eventually, hopefully, thrive. So there are countless examples of how the safety domain plays out in the day-to-day lives of the clients that we work with, but those are just a few that I wanted to highlight. So in terms of the progress for today's webinar, we'll begin with a presentation from Dr. Ilana Seff. Dr. Seff is a research associate professor at WashU in St. Louis, and her work focuses on improving the lives of vulnerable and marginalized populations across the globe through evidence-based public health solutions. Her research also encompasses prevention of violence against women and girls, particularly in humanitarian settings, and the self-reliance, psychosocial well-being, and mental health of refugees and displaced persons. Ilana also serves alongside her colleague, Dr. Lindsay Stark, as an academic advisor to the RSRI, in that role supporting learning and evaluation related to refugee self-reliance and provision of support to the global network of SRI users. So I work very closely with Ilana on that. After Dr. Seff shares, we'll move to our panel discussion where we'll hear some panelists' insights from their work across different contexts, highlighting innovative programming approaches and policy efforts related to promotion of refugee safety and security. And we've got a really good panel lined up today. The first panelist I'd like to introduce is Adriana Monar. Adriana is the Innovation Manager for Latin America and Caribbean at Chorus International. She has about 10 plus years experience advancing self-reliance and economic inclusion programming across the region. She was formerly HIAS's Regional Technical Advisor for Economic Inclusion and CVA, and she supports evidence-based program design and proposal development, integrating cross-cutting priorities, including gender and mental health. Adriana holds an MSc in global migration from UCL and has contributed to research on the links between self-reliance and mental health amongst forcibly displaced women. We've worked with Adriana for many, many years, and we're very, very glad to have her on the panel today. Our next panelist is Tamale Musa Sali, who is the team lead of Legal Awareness and Rights Protection Initiative, LARPI, a Uganda-based organization advancing access to justice, legal empowerment, refugee inclusion, and human rights protection for marginalized communities. Musa has extensive experience designing and leading initiatives focusing on refugee self-reliance, legal aid, democratic governance, climate justice, and the protection of vulnerable populations through community-centered advocacy and policy engagement. Next on our panel is Helena Minchu, who is the Global Lead for Protection, Policy, and Advocacy at IRC, International Rescue Committee, where she leads policy and advocacy for violence prevention and response for the Violence Prevention and Response Unit. She's held leadership roles with Global GBV Area of Responsibilities Policy and Advocacy Reference Group, Interactions GBV Working Group, the Call to Action on Protection from GBV in Emergencies, and the Alliance for Child Protection and Humanitarian Action. Her work has focused on advancing funding and policy priorities for GBV prevention and response in emergencies. Prior to joining IRC, Lena worked at the International Women's Health Coalition as a program officer on the U.S. Foreign Policy and Advocacy team, and has co-chaired Girls Not Brides USA. She represented IWHC at the UN in New York, Addis Ababa, and Geneva, advocating for gender equality and sexual and reproductive health rights. So we're grateful for all the panelists joining today. And to all of you for being part of this conversation. We encourage you to engage, reflect, and think about the ideas shared today, how the ideas shared today may impact your work and context. Some quick housekeeping notes. We'd be happy if you'd introduce yourself in the chat box and add any questions you have to the Q&A box. I believe you'll all see that on your screen. So let me know if that's not appearing. Captions are available in multiple languages, so you can, to access them, you can turn the Zoom menu on your screen, select captions, and then select your speaking language, and you'll see captions displayed for the session today in that language. So I think with that, I'm pleased to kick off the webinar on safety today and turn it over to Dr. Ilana Seff for a presentation during which we'll review the purpose of the safety domain, the challenges with measuring safety as a construct, and the different versions of the safety domain that we as the RSRI team have used over the 3 versions of the SRI, and explain kind of how the current version works in SRI 3.0. So without further ado, and if there are no kind of other housekeeping issues, I think I would pass it over to Ilana.
Thanks, Ned. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to hear the panelists speak as well. I'm going to be presenting on behalf of both myself and Dr. Lindsay Stark, who's going to be off camera for the presentation, but here to answer any questions. And I'm going to really be, let me share my screen. Okay. Someone just flag in the chat if you can't see that, but I think it's being shared. So I'm going to talk, as Ned said, kind of about the importance of the safety domain, which is one of the 12 domains in the SRI, kind of the different challenges that we've encountered over the years in measuring safety, which is a pretty challenging construct to measure. And then look at the different ways we've tried to measure what's worked, what hasn't, and finally summarize kind of what our current domain looks like and what the data suggests so far. So as you know, and as Ned helpfully highlighted, the SRI is designed to track households' progress toward self-reliance over time to support programming, monitoring and evaluation, and research. So we really want to understand kind of why does the safety domain matter? And both Lindsay and I have been academic advisors for the SRI for almost 8 years. And so we have really seen, we were there kind of when we were originally struggling with how to measure safety, and have really seen the domain evolve and go through several iterations. So safety really is foundational. And, you know, as Ned kind of said, if people don't feel safe or they are actually not safe objectively, they're less likely to be able to go to work, to go to school. Their lack of safety may also relate directly to their housing situation. So they may be in an unsafe housing situation. And threats to safety are especially relevant to the population served by the SRI. So this is really an important domain for a number of reasons. But it is very difficult to measure. So it can mean a number of things, and I'll elaborate on this more a little bit further on in the presentation, but it can mean both, the perception of a safety issue. It can be an actual direct threat to someone's safety. It can be fear that is remaining from a past incident, a past safety incident. So potentially, who's someone who experienced an assault or harassment that's not ongoing, but the person still feels unsafe. And as a result, it's still impeding their ability to seek employment or to seek out their basic needs. And then finally, that. Um, the domain, as we were thinking about how to measure this, needed to really stay simple. So this is a very complex construct. It's challenging to measure, and ideally, we would have a number of questions to really capture the range of experience, the range of safety experiences that someone is experiencing, how they're impacting different people in the household, how that's impacting different people in the household's ability to be self-reliant. But the SRI is a high-level household tool, and so we needed to make sure we could balance these nuances with safety and also the purpose of the SRI, which is that it really can't be that complex. And I just also want to reiterate that what we're interested in here is not just safety, but also kind of understanding how safety impedes self-reliance. So this just shows kind of a few different iterations of the safety domain that we've kind of saw at the beginning before releasing the version 2.0 of the SRI. So when we first kind of joined the team, the safety domain was measured with one question. In general, does anyone in the household have safety concerns that interfere with daily life, such as work, school, shopping, or community life? And you can see the answer choices focused on, kind of a level of frequency in general. Then we modified the tool a bit. We specifically changed the reference period to 6 months. So instead of asking in general, we wanted to really help households think about a specific period, so the last 6 months. And we changed the response choices to be a bit more explicit. So actually naming the number of times in order to to ensure that households were thinking about the number of safety incidents in the same way. Then we tried a new approach, which limited the reference period from 6 months to 3 months to be in line with the reference period for a lot of other questions. So any question in the SRI that asks about a period of time is looking at the past 3 months. And we also expanded the first option to be from more than 5 times to more than 5 times, and also just sort of a general and pervasive feeling of insecurity. There were several other iterations that I'm not sharing here. So we really tried so many different things in trying to measure the safety domain. One thing that really also wasn't working from this last iteration is this notion of kind of daily life. We realized we really needed to get a bit more specific. So it wasn't just daily life that we were interested in, but does it impede the ability to meet basic needs and seek opportunities for the future? And so ultimately, when version 2 of the SRI was released, we use the following domain. So many of you, especially if you've been using the SRI for a long time, are probably very familiar with this version of the domain. So does your household currently feel safe enough to pursue all of the social, economic, and educational opportunities you want? And then the response choices indicate if the household feels safe enough to pursue all opportunities, safe enough to pursue some, or does not feel safe enough to pursue any opportunities. And so this version of the tool of the domain was out there for about 2 years before we started to really revisit the domain and think, is this working? Is this measuring what we want it to measure? And so in early 2022, we basically looked at all the data we have. So as many of you know, we work with lots of partner organizations who are using the SRI, where we are providing some analytical support, and in turn, they're sharing the data with us. And so we had lots of data from a range of many different contexts being implemented with lots of different populations. And we wanted to understand, if we look at this data, what can we learn about how the safety domain is working? And specifically, what we did is did sort of a rapid qualitative analysis of all of the comments. So as you know, for each domain, there's an answer choice that you select, but there's also a comment box where the person administering the tool can provide more detailed information. In this case, probably what the safety concern is, how it's impacting the household, and potentially flagging that this household needs a protection or other type of referral to address this safety concern. So when we did kind of a rapid analysis of all of these qualitative responses, we really wanted to ensure that we were capturing what we intended. So a few of the things that stood out when we did this. So there were some positives with the domain. So the score we found was varying by context in the ways that we would expect. So, for example, the average safety scores were lower in settings with active conflict. So, for example, in Somalia and Syria, and then in samples where we had both, let's say, refugees and host populations, safety domain tended to be lower for refugees versus the host populations. And so that was at least some signal that the safety domain was capturing something that we would expect. We also saw that the safety domain was correlated with other domains where we would expect safety to have an impact. So those who reported safety interfering with more opportunities also had lower food and employment scores. But there were kind of mixed results with assistance and social capital. So we were starting to see some signal that perhaps the safety domain wasn't capturing exactly what we wanted. We also saw that the comment use was inconsistent. So some partners weren't using the comment section at all. So they weren't providing any information about what the safety concern was. If the household scored a 1 or a 3, we knew there were safety concerns that were impeding seeking opportunities and basic needs, but we had no sense of what those safety concerns were. And there was also a varying level of detail. If the person administering the tool felt like a referral was needed, if it wasn't. So we found that organizations weren't necessarily able to track referral needs in a systematic way with this version of the domain. And then comments revealed many different types of risks, which I'm going to elaborate on in a second. And also the construct itself kind of remained blurred. And that wasn't just for people using the tool, that was even with the RSRI team internally. We really struggled with what exactly are we trying to capture with this domain? Obviously, as I said, safety is so complex. There's so many different things we could capture, but what is the most relevant for self-reliance? So I mentioned that there were many different types of safety concerns that were put in the comments. So we had direct experiences of violence, for example, assault, kidnapping, violence against children or intimate partner violence, but there were also threats of violence and ongoing harassment. Some households, when answering the safety question, actually talked about some mental health conditions or disability. So they were perceiving these things as impacting their safety, which was interesting to us and not necessarily what we wanted to be capturing in this domain, because some of that is captured in the health status domain as well. There were concerns about their documentation, risk of being deported, lots of discussion or comments on discrimination. And then, as I said, some issues with housing and shelter. And so, as you can see, just having this one score of a 1, 3, or 5 really hid what type of concern was taking place. And specifically, there were 3 kind of overall categories that we were seeing coming up. So the first was a perceived safety issue. So this was a fear that at least someone in the household had that reflected either an ongoing issue or past trauma, and that residual fear was impacting their ability to seek opportunities. And so that's important to understand if that's the safety issue, because that would really require kind of a mental health and psychosocial support referral as opposed to a protection referral alone. We also had a lot of individual concerns. So threats from landlords, from partners, family members, harassment, assault, that really would probably require a targeted protection referral. And then the last category we saw was kind of just general community level safety concerns. So these might not necessarily be addressed through a household level referral, but really required structural responses. And we wanted to be able to differentiate between these three so that organizations could effectively have enough information from this domain to effectively provide referrals. So again, we had to keep the domain brief enough while also collecting enough information to get at all of these pieces. So just to highlight kind of after we did all of this review, we had a few things we knew we wanted to achieve with the new domain. So we've realized we're going to need to move from one single question to asking about a list of various safety concerns. So we can actually know in the tool what the issues the household is facing are. We wanted to still keep this notion that what we're interested in is how safety is impacting self-reliance specifically. We wanted to keep the last 3 months period. That was crucial. We wanted to, again, separate out and understand whether or not safety incidents were occurring and then know about how it's affecting opportunities or basic needs. And we wanted to ultimately have the new version of the domain be more actionable for referral purposes. So if you have been using the newer version of the tool, the SRI 3.0, then you have seen this domain. So there are 2 questions now. 6A says, now I would like to read you a list of different safety concerns one by one. I'm interested to know if your household has experienced or been fearful of any of these things in the last 3 months. And then the enumerator will read each option out loud. So that's critical. We really want them to probe about each item, and the respondent will either say yes or no. And so at the end of this question, you'll have some number of safety concerns identified, or option 9, no safety concerns identified. If the household says that they do have at least one safety concern, then in 6B, we're asking, okay, you mentioned that you had these safety concerns. Has this in the last 3 months impacted the household's ability to seek opportunities or access basic needs? And it's either yes or no. And so the way this works for scoring is if the household doesn't have any safety concerns at all, they're a 5. If they have safety concerns, but it's not interfering with their basic needs in the last 3 months, they get a 3. And if they have safety concerns that are interfering with their basic needs in the last 3 months, they get a 1. And so this is the new version of the safety domain that we've been using for at least a year at this point. And I also want to flag that what is also really useful about this version is that this list of safety concerns here can be customized for your context. So we have had partner organizations remove a couple of these items because they're not relevant. We've had them add some additional options that are, more germane to the context. And so that's also, we have found been really helpful for partners. So what are we finding so far? So this just represents a few applications of the new domain. So looking at some data from partner organizations in Nigeria and Kenya, just to kind of give you a sense of how we can get a bit more granular and really understand what the safety concerns are. Importantly, 34% of households reported no safety concerns, and this was even higher in Nigeria than in Kenya. But when we're thinking about what safety concerns are really the most relevant, so the most commonly reported concern in Kenya was theft or robbery. And in Nigeria, it was unsafe housing or eviction. And then other commonly reported concerns In Kenya included harassment and unsafe housing or eviction, and in Nigeria included kidnapping and theft or robbery. And about 13 to 14% of households in both countries reported experiencing community or country level conflict in the last 3 months. And then among those who reported at least one safety concern for their household, about half reported that it interfered with basic needs, and half reported that it didn't. So we're still kind of unpacking the data that we're receiving from partner organizations, and hope to really be able to say more about these different safety concerns. But overall, just in summary, the final version of the SRI really reflects three key intentional changes that we wanted to make. So we knew that we wanted to keep safety in the index and make sure it was still capturing whether or not it's impacting self-reliance. We needed to understand the different types of safety concerns that were taking place so that we could make referrals more actionable, and hopefully learn more overall about the safety concerns facing these populations. And so ultimately, we feel that this domain is more interpretable, more actionable, and also still brief enough that it is, manageable for partner organizations to use. And that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Alana, for sharing some of the kind of practical implications of the safety domain and how it has evolved over time. I think one of the important things that all should know about the Self-Reliance Index is that it is a tool that we're constantly sort of reflecting on how it's working, whether or not practitioners are getting what they need out of the Self-Reliance Index, and whether all the domains are really kind of working as we intended them to work. And I think the safety domain is probably the primary example of a domain which we've looked at over the years and continue to refine. And I think one thing that I guess I would like to plug is our Cycle 3 learning report. And I think one of my colleagues can put the link in the chat to that. But the Cycle 3 learning report really is where we sort of chart evolution of the tool and why changes have been made, as well as highlighting learning objectives going forward. So topics that we continue to be curious about in terms of the Self-Reliance Index. For example, what self-reliance looks like at the camp level versus the urban level, or how household gender dynamics can influence a household's ability to become self-reliant. And so for those of you that might be interested in contributing to this learning process and sharing with us your findings and giving us feedback, I think the Cycle 3 learning report is a great starting point to see the main questions that we continue to ask as we move forward with the current version of the tool, which is SRI 3.0. And yeah, thanks very much, Alana, for the presentation. I believe those slides will be made available to the group after the session. And so that all being said, I'd like to begin the panel discussion so we can dive deeper into the safety domain and kind of the topics that revolve around that. Please remember, just another housekeeping note, to post questions that you may have to the Q&A so we can address those. We'll have a bit of time at the end to get to as many of those as we can get to. But our first two questions for the panel will be round robin style. And so I'll call on each panelist to give us a brief 2-minute response before we dive deeper into today's topic. So for the first question, starting with Musa, please. Please tell us a bit about your organization's work related to safety and or protection for refugees and other displaced populations. Musa, over to you. And thanks for joining.
Okay, thank you so much, Need. My name is Musa Tamale Sali, and I represent Legal Awareness and Rights Protection Initiative. LAPI is a Ugandan civil society organization which is committed to advancing human rights, access to justice, and protection of vulnerable or marginalized persons, of which refugees and displaced populations include. And in relation to protection, For refugees and displaced populations, our work focuses on protection systems through legal empowerment, rights awareness, physical social support, and strategic advocacy. And this has been seen in one of our projects in refugee hosting communities in northern and West Nile region of Uganda, where, for example, in Rain Camp, refugee settlement, and Kiriandongo refugee settlement, where we work to improve access to justice and protection, and we provide protection services for women, girls, adolescents, and other at-risk groups facing violence, exploitation, discrimination, and exclusion. And as part of our work as LAPI, our work is committed to is community based. We make sure we engage the communities that we work with in the legal education and protection awareness, and this helps the displaced persons to understand their rights and navigate the available protection mechanisms. Yeah, we also work with the local leaders, service providers, to ensure that the refugees are helped and assisted.
Thanks very much, Musa. And yeah, thank you for your work as well. I think same question to Adriana, if you don't mind. So yeah, how uh, a little bit about Chorus and the work that you're doing related to safety and protection for refugees, other displaced folks.
Thank you so much, Ned, and good morning, everyone. At Chorus International, and specifically through our organizations, Lutheran World Relief and IMA World Health, which are part of the big Chorus family, our work with displaced populations is very rooted in the premise that safety and self-reliance are interdependent. In our work in Latin America, I think one of the clearest examples of how we address safety through access is our Ben Informado platform in Peru. This is a digital platform and actually a service center that became a lifeline for thousands of Venezuelans, refugees and migrants. So through this platform, we were providing accurate and real-time information on legal processes, labor rights, and other specialized services, in particular linked to mental health, but also livelihoods. But we didn't, just offer information. I think this was a protection tool. Because I think that when we offer people access to trusted guidance, they tend to be less vulnerable, for instance, to risks such as traffickers. They are also less likely to be exploited in informal labor markets. And overall, they are just better equipped to navigate all the different and new systems in a more safe way. And yeah, building on this experience that we had in Peru, we are also launching a new project in Ecuador. It's the Safe Passage or Paso Seguro project that is actually going to go a step farther. On this project, we're going to focus, of course, on a continuum of care that will begin with immediate safety and protection, providing guidance on legal rights, regularization, which is, of course, the foundation of institutional safety. But we're also going to be providing psychosocial support, acknowledging that mental well-being is a key piece of the security of a household. And then we're going to move towards the stabilization and self-reliance. But in short, for us at Chorus International, we think that protection isn't a separate department, it's the foundation for our different livelihoods designs and just to provide safety overall. I think we have to have these cohesive interventions that include all these different phases. Thank you, Ned.
Thanks, Adriana. Appreciate it. Next, I think we'll go to Lena Minchu from IRC. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work you're doing.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ned. And thank you for inviting me to be here. Really excited to chat with you all and learn more about the index myself. So as was mentioned, I'm with the International Rescue Committee. We are operational in about 40 countries around the world, supporting those who are either refugees, asylum seekers, or displaced in some way, or living in humanitarian conflict or crisis, to be able to thrive and access the services that they need. I work within the Violence Prevention and Response Unit. We're a technical unit that provides the technical guidance and advice to programs across the globe on protection issues. And we basically break that down into three big buckets. One is women's protection and empowerment, which is what we call our gender-based violence prevention and response work. The second is child protection. So working to ensure that children are free from or able to safely come back from maltreatment, exploitation, abuse, etc. And then the third is our protection and the rule of law work, which is really around access to justice, legal protection, documentation, and also does our protection monitoring and analysis work. We have programming in most of our countries across those three domains. And we also work as much as we can to kind of influence the overall field, whether that's working with the Global Protection Cluster and the coordination mechanisms at the global level or at country level, by presenting evidence or doing advocacy efforts to kind of move people into caring about protection issues and utilizing programs that we know work, or acting as a advisor to those groups. We really do try to bring our expertise and the expertise of our colleagues across the world to bear in those spaces. And then I'll close this bit by saying that across all of those domains and all of that work, we're supported by, and I would say pushed also by, our team in the Safe, Inclusive, and Transformative Programming Unit, which sits in my unit. Safe, Inclusive, and Transformative Programming really looks at how intersecting identities, so whether that's gender, sex, ability, age, religion, etc., impact not only how our clients are experiencing the world, but also how our services might impact those clients and how they might experience our services, so that we're always keeping that lens in all of our work. And that sits within our unit, but is across the entirety of the IRC. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Helena. Really interesting to hear about how some of those intersections affect actual service provision. So thanks for sharing that. I think for the next question, this one will go, I think, to Adriana first. So thinking about, some of the different contexts in which you and Chorus work, what are the most significant safety and protection related barriers that refugees face in progressing towards self-reliance? Feel free to share with us.
Ned, I'm going to speak of the context of Ecuador, and in particular through our Safe Passage project, where I think we see probably three key safety barriers. The first one being, of course, the lack of legal identity and documentation. And this is very, very severe, in particular for deportees, for third country nationals, and for returnees who arrive with nothing, Without documents, they are excluded from the formal sector, and they are usually pushed into high-risk informal work, where, of course, there's a risk of wage theft, labor exploitation, and for them, just trying to make a living becomes a very, very big safety risk. I would say that the second one is territorial insecurity and sometimes even extortion, and they are locally known as vacunas. So for refugees and returnees, it's sometimes difficult in some areas of the country to start small businesses because criminal groups and gun violence tend to be a constant threat. We have seen many households that intentionally, try to keep their business invisible or just via social media or extremely small just to avoid being targeted for extortion, which of course definitely caps their economic growth. And I would say the third one is the barrier of psychological safety safety, and Chorus International focuses a lot on providing the safe spaces and different resources and even one-on-one counseling to address mental health issues that can have an impact. So I think the trauma of the migration journey combined with the stigma of being deported or being even a third country national who sometimes doesn't even speak the local language, which is also increasing xenophobia in some of the host communities, can actually create a state of, chronic stress. Everyone is in this survival mode, which actually impacts on how they make a living and impacts all the different dimensions of the household. So I think it's really important to address these three barriers. Of course, there are more, but I would say that these are the most relevant ones in our context. Thank you, Ned.
Appreciate that, Adriana. Same question to Lena, if you don't mind, some of the kind of more significant safety protection related barriers that you notice that refugees face when trying to move to be more self-reliant.
Yeah, of course. So I was struck when Dr. Seth said the construct remained blurred when she was talking about the safety domain earlier, because when I was thinking about how to answer this question, I kind of zoomed out from the individual, which Adriana did a great job of kind of going through what a lot of the individual issues are. But I zoomed out to kind of what the structural issues are, and construct remains blurred. What is safety? What is protection? I think is one of our bigger challenges as a field, and does sometimes inhibit the work on our side as humanitarians to provide people with the services they need to become self-reliant. The other two things in terms of kind of like a bigger global picture that I would really highlight for this question are, first, we're going through a very challenging time within the humanitarian space in which we're being directed by OCHA and other decision makers to hyper prioritize. And that's because of the humanitarian reset, because of the UN 80 process, which both look to shift and restructure and reprioritize kind of what is necessary in humanitarian response. Within that hyper prioritization, we have really often heard that we need to be looking at the most efficient, the most effective, and the most life-saving services. And the rest of the services that we've kind of been doing over the last 20, 30 years are kind of being pushed to the sides. And with the construct remains blurred kind of lens, when people can't really access like what are protection services, when it's not as obvious as water and food, and when the survival needs are not as necessarily proximate or obvious as water and food, that hyper prioritization effort can really push protection and safety and self-resilience and reliance out to the sides of humanitarianism, which in turn means that those efforts don't get prioritized when it comes to funding decisions. So I'd say that is one of the bigger issues. The second piece is that we do maintain or remain a very segmented system. We have our clusters. The protection cluster is separated from the health cluster, is separated from the education cluster. And that's not necessarily how people live their lives. It's not how they experience violence. People experience violence across all of the spaces in which they exist. And it's not reflective of what we know is kind of good practice when it comes to actually providing people with services that they need that would help them become self-reliant. And the other piece that I'll just highlight is, when we have recognized for years that protection, that safety is everyone's responsibility. But we do, I think, in practice find that when it's everyone's responsibility, it can often become no one's responsibility. And I think especially when we are in this state of hyper prioritization, if safety is not one of your key performance indicators as a humanitarian, if you are more concerned about the number of people getting or not getting cholera, but not if they're safe on the way to a clinic or on the way to the latrine, those pieces of your work very quickly can fall to the sides. And I think that's where we're at as a field, that we need to really keep pushing and arguing for protection, not just being central as the Interagency Steering Committee's centrality of protection policy says it is, but also that it is critically life-saving. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Lena, and thanks for, I think, bringing the current context in and how that sort of relates to the work that we do in protection and related to safety. I think is really important to think about. So I appreciate that so much. In order to wrap up this question, Musa, would you like to speak to some of the barriers that you're seeing, safety, security-wise, to promotion of self-reliance in LARP's work?
Hello?
Yep, we can hear you. If you can hear
From
us.
our experience at LAPI, given the fact that Uganda is one of the countries with the largest number of refugees, some of the biggest barriers that refugees face in becoming self-reliant are protection risks, limited access to justice, economic exclusion, and social stigma. Many refugees, especially women, girls, and other marginalized groups, face gender-based violence, exploitation, discrimination, and weak reporting or referral pathways, which undermine their safety and confidence to participate fully in their societies, both in the refugee settlement or host communities. They also face economic barriers. So this limits their livelihood opportunities, the lack of skill development, and restricted access to financial resources. Given the fact that they do not have documentation, it's very hard for financial institutions to give them loans, so that undermines their economic, they cannot participate or put food on the table. Then the other challenge is limited access to rights and available protection mechanisms. Given the fact, refugees, like, they are not aware of the language. Most of them are from Sudan, DRC, so and the area where the refugee settlements are located, the communities speak different languages, different from the ones of refugees. So there's that, they cannot work together in most cases. Yeah, and finally, there is social exclusion and stigma, both within the host communities and in the refugee settlements. Yeah, so this limits the refugees, to participate fully in those areas, both communities and the refugee settlements. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Musa. And if you don't mind, I'd like to stay with you for a few more minutes here, because the next question relates on some of the things that you touched on. But really, what I guess I'd like to ask is how you think safety and protection concerns affect other things or other domains of the Self-Reliance Index that we think are essential to self-reliance. So employment, health, financial inclusion, social capital. So I'm curious to see how you see the interplay between kind of more direct safety and security concerns and how those play out in some of the other domains that we cover in the Self-Reliance Index. You expand on that a little bit for me, please?
Okay, thanks for the question, Need. Safety and protection concerns directly affect every aspect of refugee self-reliance. For example, when refugees face or experience violence, discrimination, exploitation, or insecurity, it makes it harder for them to access employment or livelihood opportunities. And in many workplaces, markets, or training spaces due to fear of harassment or abuse. So this limits their economic independence due to the violence, the discrimination, the exploitation. They fear to be exploited. So they do not, they limit themselves, and this, it prohibits or it reduces their economic independence. So, and if we to go to protection risks, which I earlier pointed on, so protection risks also significantly affect health and well-being. Exposure to violence, trauma, or chronic insecurity often leads to stress, anxiety, or poor mental health. And this reduces their resilience and ability to work, study, or engage productively. Because, if you're stressed, you cannot be productive. Trust me. So, in relation to the financial inclusion, refugees who fear exploitation or lack legal documentation, for example, the national IDs, there are those cards for refugees that they are usually given. They often struggle to access banking services. So they cannot also join the saving groups, which we call the circle groups here in Uganda, and they do not get the credit opportunities. So this keeps them trapped in informal and insecure survival systems.
Thank you very much, Musa. I appreciate you kind of elaborating on that a little bit. And Lena touched on one of the kind of the direct interplay. She gave the example of accessing cholera care. What happens if you're harassed on the way to accessing that, and how that sort of interplay happens? Lena, would you mind expanding a little bit on the question about how these domains sort of play together, how safety and security concerns can affect everything else?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think the thing, just my earlier point about that we keep these pieces separate sometimes in how we respond, and that doesn't reflect people's realities, I think bears repeating. So people who experience safety risks know what they are. They also don't necessarily see them separate or in like a separate part of their life from the safety risks that they're experiencing. So while we might, as humanitarians, as responders, might think, okay, economic empowerment is somebody else's job, or safety on the way to a health center is someone else's job. That's not how people are experiencing their lives. And I think it's really critical to not only know that, but also know that we see that in data. For instance, IRC did an analysis of 12 years of GBV information management service data, so GBV IMS data, from almost 220,000 of our clients over the last 12 years. As far as we know, it's the longest kind of study and analysis of its kind. And some of the findings were totally what we thought they'd be. Intimate partner violence is the most common form of violence that women and girls experience. Adolescent girls experience violence differently than adult women. We knew that that was going to be the case. But some of the information was actually kind of more new or interesting to us. And I think in this field of self-reliance and seeking services that would allow you to either overcome safety risks or deal with them is one of the places where we found kind of not more interesting, but more new data. So one of the things that was found is that our clients really looked much more for care services than redress services. And we thought about care as like health services, economic empowerment, et cetera, redress, more access to justice. So in terms of care services, we saw a really positive picture in some of the places that we had put a lot of effort and investment, unsurprising, where women and girls said we need access to health services. It was about 87% of those who wanted health services after being talked to by a protection colleague at the IRC were able to access those services. So for the majority of people who knew that they needed further care through health, they were able to get referred to that. There's a worse picture when you look at things like livelihoods. So only 60% of, 60% of survivors who sought services for livelihoods or access to livelihoods services did not have those programs available to them. So a lot of people really want livelihood services. They recognize that in order to maybe leave an unsafe household or support their children should something happen to family members in a time of crisis or conflict, for instance, that they need access to livelihood services. But in 60% of the cases, it was just not available. And that links us and shows us a structural issue, a systemic issue. That's not individuals not wanting to access those types of services. It's the fact that we as a field have not invested in them and have not invested in those links, recognizing that self-reliance relies on us being there to provide the services that people want. I'll put the study that comes from in the chat so that people can kind of get into it more. But I do think it's just really critical for us to recognize that all of these domains are incredibly connected for individuals, and we as a field need to do a much better job of connecting them when it comes to those who are providing services. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And yeah, if you could put a public link into the chat that covers that research, I think that would be very interesting for everyone and well received. Of course, your comments on kind of how these are all integrated. I mean, one of the core functions of the SRI is to look at the interplay between different facets of household life. I think practically we all know that all these things are related, but somehow when it comes to service provision, a lot of times these things can be very divided up into sectors and pillars, and really kind of non-acknowledgement of the fact that these things all really blend together at the household level. So yeah, thank you very much for your comments on that. I wanted to shift the topic a bit just to partnerships and with the refugee-led and community-based actors kind of in the forefront. Adriana, would you talk a little bit about partnerships that you've seen or been part of that have been effective in kind of advancing safety and security and self-reliance outcomes? Anything that you could share with us on that?
Yeah, thank you, Ned. And I want to go back to the 60% of people who are not accessing livelihood services that Helena flagged, because I think that's a key issue when it comes to a path towards self-reliance and safety. And that's where actors, non-traditional actors, as I like to call them, such as the private sector, come into play. In contexts like Peru and Ecuador, and I'm sure in many other contexts as well, it's not enough just, to train people for jobs, to help building skills, but we have to actually work with the private sector to create livelihoods opportunities, but also to make sure that these opportunities are safe and are done in inclusive spaces. So this means partnering with a lot of different private sector stakeholders, such as the different chambers of commerce, local businesses, to make sure that we are implementing, codes of conduct against discrimination, against harassment. But it's also very, very crucial that these partnerships work hand in hand with the government and with other community-based actors who can actually, voice the actual concerns and in particular safety concerns of workers, many issues that they can face, on their commute, in the actual workplace, after work. So in my experience, like the most effective partnerships are the ones that bridge, the protection and economic development, which usually are treated as two separate things, right? So yeah, private sector, at Chorus International, we do believe that there are 5 fundamentals that actually help people thrive. There's a safe place to live, nutritious food, quality healthcare, knowledge to grow, and also an income on to help sustain all of this. But, not in every project we can focus on all these different 5 fundamentals on our own. So we need partnerships, and that's where also these multi-sectoral referral networks come into place. We have to work with organizations who have a specialized experience in different issues. I think for the case of Ecuador, in our Safe Passage project, local legal aid is key. GBV organizations that we can refer different participants to when we detect these high-risk situations, like, I don't know, extortion, labor abuse. There's a lot of GBV risks also in the workplace. So partnering with these organizations actually help us have this immediate pathway to support people without them having to, abandon their path towards self-reliance. And of course, refugee-led and all other community-based organizations are really, really vital in context where there's a lot of fear and stigma. I think these type of groups are the ones that provide a non-judgmental space that will make people feel safe. And in particular, when it comes to deportees, which is a bit of a new phenomenon in the country, these spaces are key. I think refugee-led organizations and other community-based organizations hear about new threats and about new issues before many international organizations do. So they are sort of our eyes in the field, right? They can provide firsthand information, and they can also help us reach people that sometimes we are not seeing that could actually benefit from our services. So there's a lot of different actors that can actually contribute to creating safer spaces for refugees, for migrants, and also contribute to their self-reliance. And I think that ultimately these partnerships through common frameworks such as the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative will also allow us to speak in the same language. It's not about just providing services and creating partnerships, but again, it's about building an ecosystem that will actually support household self-reliance from all these different angles.
Yeah, thank you very much, Adriana. Appreciate that. And I kind of want to shift gears a little bit because we have referenced some livelihood sector interventions, and quite a good number of the Self-Reliance Index users globally are engaging in focused livelihood support to different communities across the globe. So the question that I wanted to address was to Lena, actually. How do you think livelihoods and self-reliance programmings can be designed to reduce safety and protection risks? Obviously, do no harm is a principle everyone here holds very dear. When we're trying to deploy services that have an end positive outcome, how can we mitigate some of the risks that maybe sometimes are inherent in the provision itself of those services?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the first things that is critical to recognize is that there are a number of people who are marginalized that we do not see, whether it's because they do not have the ability to access our services or because we are not reaching out to them. We don't see them accessing our programs. And if we don't see them, if we don't try to collect data on their experiences, we do worse in knowing how to program for them. So back to that study or the analysis that I flagged earlier, when we looked into 12 years of our data, we had only 4.1% of incidents of GBV reported to us were from women over the age of 49. 4.1%. We know that about a third of the global population is over the age of 49. So can we assume that only a very, very small population of them are experiencing GBV? Or can we assume that we as the IRC are not yet doing a good enough job of reaching out and finding them and reaching them with services that make sense for them? At the same time, it was only 1.8% of women and girls who reported incidents of GBV also were living with a disability. We know that over 10% of the global population lives with a disability. So us only, our services only being 1.8% reaching those women and girls, that just can't be considered good enough. And I think that that's one of the first lines is to recognize that if you are not seeking to reach out to those populations, if you are not making sure that you have data on them and you do not see whether they are or are not accessing your services, you can't make sure that those services are safe and accessible to those populations. One other population I'll note that we just actually have no global data on is people who identify as LGBTIAQ or plus. And that's for some very good reasons that collecting data on those populations can be a risk factor in and of itself in countries or contexts where it is illegal to be identifying as part of that community, or the stigma of being part of that community can put them at physical, psychological risk. But it does in turn mean that we're not sure if we're reaching them. And because we know they are at higher risk across so many domains, that's a real lack in all of our ability to reach them with safe programming, whether that is livelihoods or health or other domains of self-reliance. The last kind of thought I'll leave us with on this question is about seeing people within their households. I recognize that the domains and the index really does look at household level self-reliance, but experiences of safety or threat are really individual. We've talked about gender, we've talked about I've talked about disability, but if you ask a household, is someone in your household feeling unsafe, and you ask potentially the parents of an adolescent girl, the parents might think everyone is safe or feels safe. The girl, depending on the context she lives in, might feel very unsafe because she's heard conversations from her parents about that they're trying to find a spouse for her. And she's a child who doesn't want to get married, but she's not the one answering the questions. And that actual experience of child marriage can look different from a safety perspective, depending on who you ask. And so I think it is important for us to really recognize that even within the domains of the index, or even within any tool that you're going to use to understand who is and isn't safe, you do need to look and scratch at it a little bit more to make sure that you're understanding what that individual's experience of safety within their home or community are. And recognize that the home and the immediate community, particularly for women and girls, tends to be the least safe place for them. Intimate partner violence is the most common form of violence for adolescent girls and young boys too. The most common perpetrators of violence against them, including sexual violence, are people within their immediate close circle. And so you do need to make sure that you're looking much more deeply than just asking parents, caregivers, heads of household, when you want to understand not only what's happening, but then how you can create programs that responds to those individual needs. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for the insights. I think it's really interesting, and I think vexing kind of in a way to think about how many communities that we are trying to serve are actually invisible to our assessments or the work that we do to try to forge interventions. So very much appreciate you highlighting that kind of dynamic, and it's certainly something that we see at the household levels when we're running household level assessments. That voices for one reason or another can be silenced in the process, and scratching a little deeper, as you said, is kind of the way that we can sort of reveal some of those things and then hopefully eventually respond to it. But I wanted to direct that same question to Adriana as well, in terms of kind of embedding safety, security in livelihoods provision and ensuring that one doesn't activate risks in the other. Do you mind, Adriana?
Thank you so much, Ned. Definitely. I think design needs to be locally grounded and inclusive. And again, this is where refugee-led organizations can come in and support our efforts by, helping us design something that really works for them. I think Helena has done a great job of explaining, the importance of using safety data in a responsible way and reaching people who are often overlooked, and also all the practical operations, and I want to elaborate a little bit more on that because definitely economic inclusion programs can put people in danger if we don't adapt to the specific circumstances of the people that we are serving. So there's so many questions that we have to ask when we are designing a program. Is the commute to the training safe? Do participants have access to childcare? And I think this is something that Elena already flagged. The impact of having access or not having access to childcare in terms of accessing jobs and actually being able to stay employed is huge, and this is very often overlooked. Also, questions about how we deliver cash assistance. Are we using, secure digital methods so people are not targeted for theft or for extortion? Are we really providing training to these people so they can use these digital methods in a safe way? Because again, there are so many risks around, extortion. These are very, very simple shifts in how we think when we design economic inclusion programs to make sure that safety concerns are being considered, and solutions tend to be very simple, and the community can give us these solutions. When it comes to different types of jobs, for example, like shifting the hours that we provide training to people, shifting to digital options, that can also help us. We have to consider all these different things when it comes to designing. It's not just how we do the training, it's how we deliver also the different types of assistance that we can provide, how we do this in a safe manner, and not only for our clients, but also for our staff. In particular, in this high risk context, we have to keep that in mind as well, and it can sometimes be overlooked. So thinking of how we can implement these programs in a safe way for all the different parties involved, I think is key.
Absolutely. Thank you, Adriana. I appreciate the response on that question. I'd like to, this is the last question of, I think, the panel discussion before we shift a little bit towards some of the questions that were shared with us either prior to the webinar or during the webinar and the Q&A. I think many of us know that the upcoming World Refugee Day celebration is focused on safety this year. And I'm curious to hear from Musa first, what policy commitments you think governments and international actors should be focusing on at WRD 2026 related to safety. Musa, anything you might share with us in terms of what your ask or LARP's ask or our general kind of collective ask to policymakers should be related to safety and security?
Thanks for the question, Need. As we approach the World Refugee Day 2026, governments and international actors should prioritize stronger protection-centered refugee policies that move beyond emergency response towards long-term inclusion and self-reliance. First, there must be stronger commitments to upholding the right to seek safety and protection without discrimination, ensuring refugees can access asylum, legal documentation, and protection services quickly and fairly. Second, governments should prioritize inclusive national systems by integrating refugees into their systems, for example, into the education system, the healthcare system, the employment and financial systems, rather than treating them as separate from national development planning. Then third, there is need for greater investment in protection infrastructure, such as in the gender-based violence prevention and response, legal aid, physical social support, and community safeguarding mechanisms, especially for women, the girls, and all the groups at risk. Then fourth, for the international actors, they should increase flexible long-term funding that supports both humanitarian protection and sustainable self-reliance programming, such as the livelihoods, skills development, social integration initiatives.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you, Musa. And I think on our side, one thing that I would say that we've seen in the data collected globally with the SRI is some of the success stories that are present when refugees and other displaced people can be integrated into social safety nets, national health care schemes, this sort of thing. I think a lot of our work down in Colombia, which we actually did hand in hand with Adriana, exposed that very clearly. Same question to you, Adriana. What's the ask?
Thank you, Ned. I would say first, legal safety. Government should prioritize accessible and actually predictable pathways to legal status and documentation because without papers, people cannot access jobs. They are pushed into informality and exploitation and cannot access any services or any rights, and self-reliance therefore becomes impossible. Second, I would say we need to continue investing in child protection, legal aid, and mental health. Protection services are key. They should not be seen as optional add-ons, but as core components of any type of program, of any refugee response. And third, of course, safe and inclusive livelihoods. I think all different international actors and governments should really work in strengthening labor protection and anti-discrimination measures and also work to engage different employers so refugees and migrants can actually access, dignified work without suffering harassment, without abuse, without fear. And I think that's a win-win strategy because the private sector will get qualified employees and refugees will make a decent living, contributing to the economic growth for their host community. So I think that's the angle that we have to take. How implementing all these different measures that will improve the safety of refugees and the overall self-reliance will also have a positive impact in the host communities, which I think is also key to flag.
Absolutely. Thank you, Adriana. And same question to Lena.
I'll just say, I fully agree with Musa and Adriana on their points. Countries desperately need to include refugees within their national systems and recognize that there should not be kind of a separation based on your status. We also need to see funders, whether that's countries or private foundations, et cetera, putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to financing small local organizations. To Adriana's point, those are the groups that have the trust in the communities, the access to communities, the understanding of the nuance within communities. And I'll just highlight particularly women-led and women's rights organizations when it comes to safety outcomes for women and children specifically. And then just like my little addition is to recognize that it is often financing and funding decisions that make or break whether or not we are actually prioritizing self-reliance, safety, or if we're looking at other things. One of our previous presidents here in the United States said, "Show me your budget and I'll show you your values." And it's deeply true, and it's true in the humanitarian space as well. So I would love to see countries coming forward with actual funded, budgeted investments, particularly in systems building and system strengthening. When it comes to safety, particularly, to me, that looks very much like trying to build social work systems that work for all people in a country and context, inclusive of refugees or other displaced persons. That type of commitment needs to obviously come from the highest level, but it cannot just be those ministries or departments that look at humanitarian or development issues. It needs to include conversations with like the Treasury, with other budget holders and budget deciders. So that's the kind of commitment I would love to see. Thanks.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you very much for that. And we did receive a couple questions prior to the session, and I believe we might have a couple more in the Q&A. We've just got a few minutes left. But if I could, I'd want to address the first one to Adriana. Adriana, how do you think host communities, employers, schools, local institutions contribute to safer and more equitable environments. I know last time in the last question you referenced, for example, the private sector. I'm curious how these kind of diverse communities can contribute to just in general a safer and secure environment for refugees, other displaced people.
Yeah, thank you, Ned, for the question. I think all those different actors can actually play a critical role in creating safer environments. I want to start with host communities because they are the ones who can actually reduce fear and xenophobia by, creating these spaces for regular interactions and positive interactions, actually. It could be through sports, through cultural events, through joint community projects such as community gardens and so on. So I think that when people get to know each other, tensions usually decrease. But definitely, and you have heard me in all my responses talk about the role of the private sector. I think employers and the private sector in general can actually contribute by implementing clear anti discrimination measures, anti harassment policies, also offering fair wages, because we do know that refugees, migrants are usually affected by lower wages. And yeah, also they can also create safe reporting channels when it comes to, abuse or exploitation. So a workplace that feels actually secure will allow people to actually focus on work and be more productive. And then we go back to the win-win situation. People who are happy, people who feel safe will work better, and in turn companies will be more productive, and we'll see this reflected in many different ways. I think that schools can also help make a big difference by promoting inclusive education. So we can play a critical role in training teachers to handle discrimination, so that they can make sure that, children from refugee families feel actually welcome and protected from bullying, which we are seeing increasing a lot in many different places. And finally, local institutions, I think, municipalities, health centers, the police, all the different local actors can play a role in making their services a bit more accessible and trustworthy. So this includes, in some contexts where we are receiving refugees who don't speak the local language, having staff who can provide at least basic information in relevant languages, providing clear information on rights, and again, coordinating with refugee-led organizations so we can start hitting the safety concerns that people are having and also addressing this quickly. So in short, I think safe environments have to be built by all different actors. We cannot do this alone as international NGOs. We cannot do this alone as private sector. Everyone has to come to the table to start thinking on how we can create these safer spaces where we actually move, towards active inclusion and even accountability for the populations that we work with.
Thanks so much, Adriana. I appreciate that. One more question, if I could, before we wrap up. We've just got a few minutes left. And this one I wanted to address Elena. How do you think policymakers can ensure that different strategies for promoting self-reliance amongst refugees are responsive to different categories of refugees and different vulnerabilities that may be present based on gender, disability status, age, legal status, this sort of thing? I'm curious to hear short feedback on that, if you could.
Yeah, I think just to condense the feedback, it's this idea of like, you cannot serve those that you cannot see. And so policymakers really do need to be requesting, reminding, and holding us as service providers to account to seeing and then seeing these people in our data. So making sure that you are asking questions about disability status, making sure that you are asking questions and understanding your client base beyond the very generic domains of gender or sex and age. And I said the very generic domains, recognizing that even that we often fall short on. So when it comes to kind of diversity and inclusion, making it a non-negotiable within policy from donors, I think is one of the first and easiest ways, because If we're held to account by the purse strings, we're more likely to do it. But really trying to make those domains of diversity responsive to the context, I think, is also really important. I mean, Adriana, you highlighted language. In some places, you really do need to have the funding to invest in 5, 6, 10 languages that information can be shared in, because people are coming together from a lot of diverse places, and having even just one or two keeps people away. And so that kind of, not just demanding that from donors and policymakers that you understand that, but then also being flexible enough in their funding to respond to those needs. And I think it's that kind of connection that we're not often seeing. We're often seeing a lot of asks, or some asks, for information on who are you serving, without the flexibility to say, okay, that means that we need to put more money into, or we are seeing we're serving people with 5 different language needs, and having the flexibility to put money into translation interpretation across the board. So that's would be my ask to policymakers: demand information, be flexible enough to respond to the information that is found. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists and presenters for sharing your insights and helping us to get to the bottom, or at least get all the items on the table that relate to safety and security and the complexity of the concept itself. So hopefully all who joined benefited from this discussion. If for any reason you want to connect separately to any of the presenters or panelists to discuss further, take discussions further, please do reach out to us, and we're happy to link you all together. We do hope that everyone joins our session next month, which will focus on the health status domain of the Self-Reliance Index, which looks at presence or non-presence of physical, mental health issues in the household, and the role that actually plays in households' ability to become increasingly self-reliant. We're also sharing a link in the chat for a brief survey. Those of you that are able to access that and respond to it, it does help us shape the series as we go through the year and cover all of the different domains of the Self-Reliance Index. So we would be happy to get your feedback on that survey if you wouldn't mind taking a second to do so. Additionally, and I mentioned this at the beginning, very, very happy to receive comments, questions, requests for support related to the Self-Reliance Index, not just this domain, but all of the domains, and how the tool works, how your agencies can use the tool, how they can benefit from the tool, whether you'd like to be connected to other agencies and partners that have used the tool to learn from their experiences. Please do feel free to direct your inquiries to us. Myself, I'm Meerdink at refugeeselfreliance.org. We put it in the chat already. Many of you know how to reach me already. So I encourage you, if you have questions or want to take these discussions further, to reach out to me. But again, sincere thanks to the presenters and the panelists for their participation and for educating us all on this topic. And we look forward to seeing you all next month. I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Have a great one.
So much.